there's two sides to every story. It kind of just comes down to what side of the story do you want to believe. There are no clear answers. After posting my first video, I'm thankful to say that it got a great response from a lot of people, primarily family as to be expected, but even some friends reached out to me. But the best part about this whole thing is that people started sharing their stories with me. And by their stories, I mean the stories that my grandfather told them. Some of those stories confirmed things that I had already featured in the first video. Some of them were new stories I had never heard before, and some of them were stories I had heard before but I had completely forgot about. Some of them challenged some of my beliefs and assumptions, and some of them affirmed some of my beliefs and assumptions. But there was enough there, and it sparked enough interest in me to do a little bit more exploration myself. Not only in terms of just general research, because I felt like I had a little bit more ammunition, for lack of a better term, to work with, but to kind of find out or figure out if I could find a way to somehow put all this together in some type of comprehensive manner. That is what I would like to do today, and I do feel like I have some pretty good information that I'm going to be sharing with you, so just bear with me. There are some problems as well, and that is one of the things that I think we should start by talking about. I've got my notes. This could get off the rails here, people, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure my names and dates are right. The first video I actually said a few things. Notably, I gave the wrong airborne for, what's his name, Billy Wall. I said, I think, 184th multiple times. I guess he was part of like the 180, no, I'm sorry. Again, I'm gonna get it wrong. I think it's part of the 82nd Airborne and then later the 187th. I don't know, either way. So one of the first messages I got was from my brother, Barry, and he correctly pointed out something that I was aware of, but he had some questions. It stirred some questions in his own mind, and therefore I felt it pertinent to bring this up to you guys who are out there watching, because you may come across this as well. One of the things that Barry pointed out is that there is actually a database in the archives that's specific to the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And in that database, you can actually do file searches for personnel files. Okay, I want to just pause right here and show you slides. I have several, but let's just show you what Barry sent me. So if you do a basic search for personnel files of the OSS, you should be led to this page where you can actually do a personnel file search. If you do this search under Grandpa's name, you will find that there are 0 matches. So his point is valid, and I was aware of these this particular database, and I had done the same thing he did, which was searched it to try to figure out stuff I could find about Grandpa, and I too was discouraged when I couldn't find anything. But what's happened as I've done more research on this, and I found more things out, I haven't been too discouraged by that. Just by way of example, I took some of the names from operatives who I had encountered in various books I had read and some of the research I had done. I plugged their names into the database as well, and lo and behold, nothing came up for them either. Well, these are people we know, in fact, did serve in the OSS and did various types of black ops and secret services and things like this. So again, it showed me that at least the online internet version of this is probably limited in what it can provide for us. But it does get back to this bigger point that is, at the end of the day, these operations and these missions were designed to be secrets. And that's going to be a key part of this whole story. One of the first books I decided to explore is a book called OSS, and it's written by Richard Harris Smith. This was a book that was a popular title that populated under OSS when I searched. And come to find out, Harris Smith, was actually a former member of the CIA. I don't know what he actually did there, but he retired from there, or actually he resigned, and decided to write this book called the OSS on the Office of Strategic Services. Now, The book wasn't particularly interesting or helpful in my opinion, but what I did find the most relevant was actually his own preface, where he basically says exactly what I just said, and that is that there's just so little information available. He says there still is a lot of stuff there, it's just under lock and key, and even as a former member of the CIA, he was not allowed access to those documents. In the preface, he used a lot of adjectives to talk about the OSS and this particular time in history, but I'll just give you a few of my favorite. Ad hoc, okay, madcap, and chaos. There's another book I looked at, which I'll show you right here, so hang on. Here's the book OSS by Harris Smith. Here's another by Patrick K. O'Donnell called Operative Spies and Saboteurs. See Chapter 8. So I too was excited about this book because it actually has a chapter, Chapter 8, in case you're curious, that specifically highlights the maritime unit of the OSS. Because Grandpa was in the Navy and he had trained with the underwater demolition team, I thought, well, here we go. We're going to get some great information. But even here, there's very, very limited material. It mostly highlights one particular operation that is a well-documented operation that involved some underwater demolition team members doing some work in probably what was either Dispatch 101 or maybe some of it was in Dispatch 404, which you can look those up. But again, what was happening was pretty benign. Contrary to what you might think, mostly what these guys were doing was just reconnaissance. They were checking out the beaches, making sure they were safe, and then if they were doing any type of demolition, it was not to do anything against enemy combatants, but rather just prepping these beaches for planes and ships, tanks, and things like this to be able to get to the beaches and access them more easily. Regardless of all that, what I did gain from this chapter that was informative is that it's highlighted here by O'Donnell that the UDT, the Underwater Demolition Team, that Grandpa trained with, was a part of OSS. And that's something that I wasn't entirely sure about. So essentially, what he points out is that the maritime unit, the MU of the OSS, is essentially the Underwater Demolition Team. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us that Grandpa, we know, was in training with the Underwater Demolition Team, so at least in his training, he would have been classified as OSS. Although, as we also know, that training came to an end, and while we're told the story of the ear injury and the replacement, there's still a lot of questions there which we want to talk about. In the end, I think that Annie Jacobs may have the best insight into this. And what she points out in both her books and her interviews is that the missions and the operations, especially when it comes to like boots on the ground stuff, you know, the actual missions on the ground, what they call them knuckle draggers, the guys who are actually out there doing the work. If those missions ever get released and they're available to learn about or read about, it's because the mission actually failed. So we only get to really learn about the failed missions. All the things that go as planned, that are successful, those things, by design, you never hear of. Just as a case in point, the only thing we really know about Grandpa in terms of these sort of details around some of these weird stories is Operation Crossroads, which if you don't know much about that, go check it out. There's books on that as well. A couple of them I've read, but it was an absolute disaster. So it makes sense that that would be the one that would be known and be released to the public. Okay, all that to say, a very unusual time with a lot of things going on, and it was just, like I said, very ad hoc. Things were being decided at last minute. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. Sometimes that was intentional, but more importantly, most of this stuff was buried. Either it was buried in old files, or sometimes it was not ever written down in the first place, or sometimes it was buried under false titles and false names, which is something we're going to get into a little bit later. Either way, I want to just say that these were some real problems that exist. But I think that we can get some answers by creating an actual timeline, and that's one of the things I've really worked hard to do. Talking to family, friends, and things like this, I think I've been able to get enough information that we can sort of put this all in place, so that's what I'd like to do. Firstly, I would like to start with Grandpa's story and where it begins in terms of our knowledge of it, and then sort of move from there and sort of piecemeal these other stories together, and I think we can put most of them in some type of context. We know that he began doing his training as a a Navy officer trying to be part of this underwater demolition crew. These men were originally known as frogmen, so Grandpa would often refer to himself as that. And it was a new thing that was taking place. Now, one of the stories that my cousin Gary gave me that I did not know, he said that Grandpa told him that he just basically saw either someone advertised it or told him about it, or maybe he just asked, like, what's like kind of the hardest, most difficult thing to do in the Navy? And they said, oh, well, you should go try out for the underwater demolition team. I had thought this was something where he was like selected because of aptitude. No, it turns out you just basically applied for the job. And this has been confirmed by many of these other books and things that I've read, where most of these guys saw a poster or maybe spoke to someone and they're like, yeah, if you're interested, try it, okay? So that matches Grandpa's story. But the other thing that Gary told me, which was interesting, is he said that Grandpa said he was a little bit strange or unique amongst these guys trying out for this position or these spots on the underwater demolition team. What Gary said is that most of these guys were felons or convicts. They're people who had sort of clouded or troubled pasts. And so Grandpa was a little bit of an outlier. Now, what's interesting about that is that in the OSS book that I read by Harrison Smith, he does highlight some of the qualities and characteristics of the types of people that they would look for as OSS operatives, especially if they're doing special operations. And one of the things that he highlights is they tended to be more well-educated, okay? They tended to be a little bit more idealistic, and they tended to not be bogged down or buried by any sort of ideological value systems, meaning that they weren't inherently racist or they didn't have any like opposition to varying cultures and things like that. And that was because these guys had to be sent into different places and they had to be able to comfortably move around. And if there were, biases and things that affected a person's behavior or actions, it could become problematic down the road. Well, I can say, at least again on paper, that very much fits Grandpa's personality characteristics. And it is something that sort of fits this story that Gary shared, where Grandpa was a little bit different than most of the guys in the unit, and it could be one of the reasons why he could have potentially, maybe not, been selected to do some of these other operations. Now, with that said, I think it's important to point this out. Because we know that there was an underwater demolition team, and we know that Grandpa wasn't officially on it, and we have these other documents, I think that he was probably operating under some other whatever. Probably, in just a very general sense, what they call a SO, or special operative. Now, what that entails, I don't entirely know. But it is worth pointing out that we do know that Grandpa was on a destroyer. The destroyer is known as the USS Ingram. I want to pull up a slide on that so you can look at it, and then we're going to talk about his time on the destroyer and where this destroyer went, where it was stationed, and what action it saw in the war. So here's a cool thing about this timeline, now that we have this information about the Ingram. Firstly, we know that it left the shores of California and it started to head east into China, okay? We know that Grandpa had stories about being stationed over in China on the destroyer, okay? Now, one of the things I didn't know is that this destroyer actually saw action in the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is a very, very famous battle and arguably the most sort of, for lack of a term, bloody and horrific in all the battles in Asia, in the Pacific Theater. I don't know why I can't speak. So even that right there is a cool fact, right? You've probably seen the famous pictures of the 6 guys lifting the flag, right? That's Iwo Jima, okay? It's been featured in a lot of movies. It was partially popular not only just because of the nature of the bloodiness and the severity of the battle, but also because it was well documented in some of these great photos. So, check those out if you haven't seen them. So that's a cool thing in and of itself. But this does bring up an interesting point about the OSS. Now, Gary was looking around and he found out that there were 3 detachments that took place. I'm going to show you this slide, so hang on and check this out. So if you look here on this OSS webpage, you'll see the 3 detachments listed on the left, 101, 202, and 404. If you click on 202, you can learn about what happened at Detachment 202, and there's a lot of interesting information, but most importantly, it's this mercy mission stories about operatives going in and retrieving soldiers who were left behind enemy lines. So Gary points out a story that he'd heard from Grandpa that I've had also validated by several other people, and after he told me, I remembered it myself. And what Gary pointed out is that this story seemed to potentially correlate to some of what was going on in Detachment 202, okay? Most specifically, it was these quote-unquote mercy missions where they were being sent in behind enemy lines to retrieve U.S. soldiers because Japan was not aware that the war was over yet, and they were still stuck there, okay? The really memorable story Grandpa tells is that he was trying to go in, and that the volume of Chinese people was so thick that he had to actually climb on top of them and walk on top of their heads in order to get past them to get where he needed to go. Just by a way of a personal anecdote, I remember him telling me this story when we were actually watching the movie Crocodile Dundee. And if you've ever seen this movie, there's a scene at the end where the lead character, played by Paul Hogan, he's stuck in the subway, and he's trying to get to the woman who's the female lead, and he can't get through, so he ends up climbing up on their shoulders and kind of walking on the heads. And Grandpa was watching this, and he started laughing. He said, I had to do this once. I've done this before. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, when I was overseas and I was in China, I had to get in somewhere, and something was happening. And I kind of got the feeling that, and it seemed like Gary and some of the other people I talked to, that it was almost like a riot, or people were trying to essentially get out. That's why the masses of crowds were so thick, and that's why he had to walk on their shoulders to get through. It also seems that he was going in to get people. Other soldiers. Now, I don't know if this was a POW situation or just a retrieval of lost or AWOL soldiers. There's a lot of varying stories. One of the other stories I hear that I think has gotten conflated over time is about Grandpa actually going in to retrieve some drunken soldiers from his destroyer. My Uncle Jeff actually reminded me of this story, and he gave me some details that I think will be helpful. This was a story that Jeff was told as a kid, and it's actually a story that I remember hearing when I was younger as well. The story about him going and walking on the heads of the Chinese, however, seemed to be something that I heard later, and it seemed to be a different story. Although, again, I've noticed that sometimes these two stories get conflated. But in this story, the soldiers on the ship had to pull lots to kind of figure out who was going to be tasked with this responsibility of finding all these drunk guys. It ended up being my grandfather, and he went in, he had to go with like a billy club and kind of find these guys in the bar and knock on the back of the head and drag them back home. It was a funny and humorous story, and it gets back to this idea of Grandpa having to go get people and bring back. So what's the truth? Was this also the same story? Was this a different story? Why is Grandpa going and getting people and bringing them back either way? A lot of question marks and a lot of things that still have to be figured out. But those are some stories I got, and some stories I had forgotten about and remembered only after having these conversations. Now, the next interesting thing that happens is, of course, after the war ends and the battle commences, the USS Ingram starts to head back west, but it stops off in Hawaii, okay? This is when Operation Crossroads occurs. Now, I just came across some interesting information about this particular event and some stuff that does pertain to Grandpa. So I want to show you these slides as well, so hang on and check this out.
In another one of Annie Jacobson's books on Area 51, she does a whole section on Operation Crossroads, where she notes that on site was a U.S. Naval Task Force 1. My question was, what is the U.S. Navy's Task Force 1? Okay, so there was a joint task force at Operation Crossroads, and here I can confirm the USS Ingram was part of this U.S. Task Force 1. There it is circled right there. If you want to know what that is, it was in 1946, and it said it followed the principles employees during World War II to develop amphibious task forces, but incorporated needs of scientific programs. The task force joined with other task force to create this particular task force known as Task Force 1. Here's some other slides that give a little bit of details about this. It seems that there was actually multiple agencies involved. If you look here, you can see under 1.7, Destroyer Surface Patrol Groups. This is actually what the Ingram was stationed under, so this is what Grandpa would have been part of. Here's some more information about the destroyer's responsibilities at this particular classified operation.
So yet again, this is more cool information. We've already put Grandpa at the Battle of Hiroshima on a destroyer. Now we have him as part of this U.S. Task Force 1 at this sort of classified testing site for these atomic weapons. And then from there, the ship leaves and goes further west back to the States and ends up basically anchoring offshore of California. And it sort of goes up and down the coast of California for the next couple of years, doing various tasks, okay? And again, you can find this right on the even Wikipedia page if you type in the USS Ingram. There's another weird story, though, that comes up here and I think is relevant. When I was talking to my Uncle Jeff and we were sharing these stories back and forth, I said, well, there's another weird thing that Grandpa told me. And it had to do with Howard Hughes. And I said, have you ever heard this story? And Jeff said, no, I'm intrigued. I said, well, let me tell you the story. This again involves me watching another movie with my grandpa. I think the movie, it was probably in the early 2000s. It was The Aviator, right? It stars Leonardo DiCaprio, about Hughes's life. And I was home probably from college or whatever age I was at that point in time. And we sat down to watch this movie together. I think the whole family was watching, but I happened to be sitting next to Grandpa. And it's the scene where there are bringing out and launching for its first and what will end up being its only flight of the famed Spruce Goose, right? The largest airplane ever built. Now, one of the things that the movie details is how this was actually sanctioned under special services. Hughes was making this plane in secret by order of the U.S. government. And one of the things that the film details is how Hughes himself was basically a closeted CIA operative. And he would go on to do a lot of different things with the CIA over the years, including retrieving a submarine from the bottom of the ocean in Hawaii, and even interacting with Lyndon Johnson over some of the atomic testing that takes place in Nevada. All that's sort of weird because it kind of eerily relates to Operation Crossroads, although they're totally separate events and take place decades later. It still was bizarre, but the whole thing that was weird about this story is as I'm watching this, and they're watching the this film version of the Spruce Goose taking its only flight, Grandpa says, oh, I was there. Yeah, I saw this plane. And I thought, what? I'm like, you were there when the Spruce Goose flew? And he's like, yeah, I was there. Now, again, he didn't detail if it was for this flight or other flights, but again, officially, it only took one flight. Now, I don't know. Could it have taken other flights, other places? I mean, I find it hard to believe that the government would stage a public event to fly a plane without ever having tested it. I imagine it probably had done some test flight somewhere. But what I seem to be getting is that Grandpa was actually at this particular test flight, the only time that the plane ever flew. And I thought that was really strange. And I said, well, why were you there? He's like, oh, well, you know, we were kind of stationed there. And so I went to see it. Again, not a whole lot of information. Well, come to find out, this does line up, okay? Because his destroyer was off the coast of California, it is very possible that he and some of the other guys was like, hey, Howard Hughes is flying this plane. Let's go check it out. I mean, it was a big media event, so it could have just been fortuitous. However, if we do look at this slide, there is some information that again makes you go, that's interesting. So check this out.
Okay, so here's a slide about the Spruce Goose showing it was November 2nd of 1947 that it took its one and only flight. Now, here's another slide showing that this was actually ordered by Henry Kaiser, and this was as a result of a secret operation that they were trying to use through the U.S. War Department. It ended up being known as the H-4 Hercules. That was its official name, although publicly it was popularly known as the Spruce Goose. But here's the interesting thing. As you can see here, the H-4 never flew again. Its lifting capacity and ceiling were never tested. And afterwards, a full-time crew of 300 workers, all sworn to secrecy, maintained the aircraft in flying condition in a climate-controlled hangar. The company reduced the crew to 50 workers in 1962 and then disbanded after Hughes' death in 1976.
So what that means, I don't know. But I told Uncle Jeff this story, and his response was wonderful. He heard that, and he's like, that is so strange. And he said, well, you know what? He said, if Grandpa wasn't James Bond, then he was Forrest Gump. I thought that was hysterical, and I said, that's the title of my next video. Because he's right. Either it's some type of planned thing where Grandpa is being moved around to all these really like high-profile situations because he's there by some unknown order, or he's just fortuitously popping up in all these strange events throughout World War II history. Now, it is true, obviously, during the war times, there was things going on all the time. And I think that if you talk to anyone who was in the war, they probably all have crazy stories. But the Forrest Gump hypothesis is also pretty interesting. You know, could it have just been, chance that all these things happened? I don't know. Fascinating story nonetheless, and a funny story I wanted to share with you nonetheless. Needless to say, we're still kind of at an impasse, right? What does this all mean? What do we do with this information? Is there stuff that we can work with here or not? There's two sides to every story, right? How are you gonna look at this? And it's sort of up to you. Do you go with the James Bond hypothesis on the one side, or do we do the Forrest Gump hypothesis on the other side? I don't know, but I do have some more information that I think may help tilt us in one direction or another. Now, before I say this, another thing that Jeff brought up that's really important too is something that I also encountered on my research, and that is, he said, well, there's some problems with the theory that Grandpa could have been part of the 202 dispatch, because he said, if you look in the history of the documents, it shows that the OSS was not actually allowed in the Asian theater in China because of General Douglas MacArthur. Now, let me just show you a map here, because I think this will help just to get some people organized here on what's going on, and then we'll talk about this.
Okay, so just in case you're geographically challenged, the other operations of the OSS, including, or most specifically 101, were taking place on basically the western border of China, which would have been where Burma was, Thailand, etc. Now, we know that some of the operations took place in Central Europe, places like Italy, even Yugoslavia, but the 202 operation would have been on the east side, the eastern seaboard of China, over where the Philippines and Japan are. And this is the territory that MacArthur was overseeing. The point being, MacArthur didn't want the OSS involved. So let's talk about that.
So yeah, MacArthur's over in Korea, and this would be the area where Grandpa's destroyer was stationed. Because MacArthur was not a fan of the OSS, he basically said, I don't want you guys there. Now, this in and of itself is a story that's very interesting, because what I didn't realize before all of this is that the clandestine operations of the OSS were widely unpopular with the military. And that's because up until this point in warfare, there was what was sort of adopted as sort of gentleman's rules, or whatever you want to call it. There were rules to war, laws to war. And if you were a first world country with elected officials and things like this, you didn't participate in espionage, or more specifically, what they referred to as guerrilla warfare, or what we would call black ops. And the reason for this was because these types of operations tended to be grassroots operations that started with insurgencies or rebellions, and or were the types of methodologies that were adopted by basically third world countries who were under dictatorships, right? They didn't have a centralized army. And the idea of that, if you're a first world country with a centralized army, there's certain rules of engagement. And this type of black ops operations was widely considered to be basically an act of war crime. MacArthur wanted nothing to do with it. However, if we go back and look at this slide on the OSS webpage about this particular dispatch 202, there's a little bit of interesting information that doesn't rule out the possibility that there was some type of covert OSS presence there. So check this out.
Okay, if you look at this slide on Detachment 202, you'll see the circled section, which does say there was OSS operations happening there. They started in 1943, and this did involve the U.S. Naval Group. But more importantly, if you look just below where that circle is, you'll see that what happened is General Albert C. Weidmeyer pulled the OSS under his command and started to recruit soldiers to participate in this detachment. Now, this would have been done outside the bounds or orders of MacArthur, meaning that under this particular general, he did use the OSS, and he did use it in this area, and it was Operation 202, which was the particular operation that involved the Mercy missions that sounded a lot like what Grandpa did. Now, there's more. Check out this document right here. It says here, they jointly conducted reconnaissance missions on the Japanese-held coast, sometimes penetrating several miles up into controlled areas. Okay, again, this would be Detachment 202, despite what you may have heard. Now, if that's not enough to convince you, check this out. I found this actually on the Navy SEAL webpage regarding the post-war UDTs. It says here that the reason that the UDTs were basically incorporated under the umbrella of the SEALs is because they're the only one of the World War II groups that survived doctrinally. Now, what does that mean? It's telling you that there were other operations taking place. But for whatever reason, the underwater demolition team was the only group of these maritime units, or Navy OSS, that actually existed on paper. You can see that right in that slide.
So again, it's tough to say, but it does appear that there was not only a naval presence, some naval officers, who remain nameless, were doing something with the OSS. From the Navy SEAL screenshot I showed you there, we also get the inclination that even though the underwater demolition team has now since been sort of adopted under the SEAL moniker, it appears there were other types of secret marine operations taking place that just were not officially sanctioned or officially supported and under some type of documented title, but they were taking place, and those have probably gotten lost to the annals of history. So again, it doesn't rule out these possibilities, but again, it doesn't give us a lot to work with. It's all very puzzling. So what is the truth? Well, let's look at the Forrest Gump hypothesis, let's say. Let's walk you through the story, and then let's look at the other hypothesis, and I think this will get us to where we want to go. So the first option is Grandpa chooses to go into the underwater demolition team training through the sort of frogman school. In the process, goes on a dive. Something happens to his ear. He's basically demoted and relocated onto a destroyer. The destroyer is sent out to the Pacific Theater, where it goes into battle. It sees action in several areas, including Iwo Jima, which is, again, arguably the biggest, bloodiest battle of the whole area. It then comes back, ends up in a secret classified operation known as Operation Crossroads that involves testing of nuclear warheads. After that, it comes back and ends up on the shores of California, where they go on to see Howard Hughes fly his famed Blue Goose for the first and only time in human history. It's plausible. But here's some other details that come out. This one comes from my father, so I'll start with this one. When I was asking my dad about this, he said, well, Grandpa knew pressure points. And I said, what? He said he knew pressure points. And I said, what do you mean by pressure points? And he said, he could hit points on your body and either dismantle you or disarm you or even drop you to the ground. And I was like, what? And I'm like, how do you know this? And he's like, well, he showed me when I was a kid, and he actually would do it sometimes. He knew how to do this. He was very well versed in this. And I've since had this confirmed by my uncles. In fact, my Uncle Dennis said he could do it to all over the body. It wasn't just the wrist and the back. He could actually hit pressure points all over your body. It was some type of highly trained martial art of some kind. And it begs the question, why would a sergeant gunnery in the boiler room know how to do all this highly specialized training and know these pressure points? Well, they wouldn't, of course. But there is, again, another side to the story. Perhaps Grandpa learned these things in his underwater demolition training and then just knew how to do them from there. And even though he no longer continued that training, he still had that skill set. Although where this kind of breaks down for me is it seems like Grandpa, even years later after the war, was very well versed in this. And I mean, I can't, say anything for certain, but I can say from experience, usually if you develop a skill and you're very proficient at it, it's because it's something you had to learn and something you had to use. The point being, if Grandpa just went and was working in a boiler room for the next years on a destroyer and never actually used any of these pressure points, how was he so well versed in them years later when his sons were grown up young boys? I don't know, okay? It's an interesting fact, okay? All of this leads up to another strange encounter. Sometimes life is very unpredictable and you never know what's going to happen. I was trying to get more information on Grandpa, and one of the things I was just trying to get was his service time, right? Because I was trying to construct this sort of clear timeline. Like, when was he in? When was he out? Mostly I was trying to figure this out because of the Howard Hughes things. Like, would he have still been in when the blue spruce goose, was flying? Like, all these types of things. And I couldn't find his date. So I kind of reached out to my dad, the dates. So I thought, well, let me look at his memorial when he passed away, like his obituary, or maybe, even the cemetery where he was buried, the Veterans Cemetery, may have listed that in just like his obituary. So I got on there, and then I saw this.
United States Navy SEAL, Latin Cross, Lloyd Elwin Wirtz.
I don't know why that's there. It doesn't make any sense. Is it a clerical error? Or I thought, maybe one of the family members told the people at the cemetery, Grandpa, he was like a Navy SEAL, and they just sort of okay, put it in there. I didn't know. Either way, I thought that was curious and weird. But it maybe had an idea in my head. And I was like, I don't know why I hadn't thought of this before. I do route work for my job. And as it turns out, one of the businesses that I service is actually the National Cemetery. That's a veteran cemetery here in South Florida. It's a massive, massive facility where they bury a lot of these veterans. And I thought, well, I know the people there because I go there every month. I bet I could ask them and see if maybe they could use their database, right, their search engines, and see if maybe they could find more information. I was mostly just thinking about the curious thing that in this thing it was listing him as a Navy SEAL, which he wasn't, as far as I knew. And I'm like, why does the cemetery have him listed as that? Is this a clerical error or misinformation or just miscommunication, or do they know something we don't know? So I thought, well, next time I'm there, I'll ask them. And fortuitously, I looked on my schedule, and there they popped up. I think it was the next day or maybe the day after that. I was actually scheduled to be at this cemetery. So I go in there, and my initial plan is to just go to the front desk and ask, one of the receptionists, like, hey, just while I'm here, I have a question. My grandfather was a war veteran. He's buried in a cemetery, a veteran cemetery. It's not in Florida, it's in Michigan. But do you guys have a shared database? I'm just trying to get some information. But as I'm going around servicing this location, I'm outside and I see a man, an older man, an African-American man, and he's just sort of standing out there. And he worked there. I've seen him before. I've seen him in his office when I've serviced them. I didn't know his name or who he was. But I thought, well, maybe he could direct me in the right way. So I said, excuse me, sir, can I ask you a question? And he's like, sure. I said, hey, listen. I said, my grandpa's a veteran. And I said, he's passed away. He is buried in a veteran cemetery, not unlike this one. But I said, it's out of state. It's in Michigan. But I said, I was trying to get some information on him. Would you guys be able to look in your database and find stuff out about him? Or do I have to go through the cemetery where he's buried, or what are you using? Yada, yada, yada. Just kind of trying to get some basic direction of what to do. And he was very helpful. He said, we can give you information. He said, it's going to be the same information that you get from the archives, that you can find online, or you can actually, he said, they don't have everything online. You can actually send them a letter or request it and they'll get it. But that's the only thing that we have. And he said, and unfortunately, if it's something where he's buried out of state, you would need to contact them because our systems are not connected. And I said, okay, whatever. And so I thought, well, that's kind of a dead end. But then this man says, well, what is it you're trying to figure out? And I said, my grandpa, he has a lot of these stories. And I said, some of them are kind of strange and interesting, but they don't always make sense. And for whatever reason, he wasn't really always the most forthcoming with information. Me, my cousins, my uncles and things, we'd ask them these questions and he would kind of give us answers, but they're kind of non-answers. And he's like, okay, yeah, that's interesting. And he said, well, what do you know about him? And I said, well, I mean, the big thing is, we know he was in training, the underwater demolition team, which is basically like a precursor to the SEALs. He's like, yeah, I know what that is. And I said, yeah, there's a museum down here in Florida. He's like, yeah, correct. And I said, but we've contacted the museum. They have no record of my grandfather. He just said he was in the training, and that does seem to be accurate. But apparently during the training exercise, he's one of the demolition trainings or something. His ear got injured, blew out or something. And as a result of that, he was removed. And at this point, the man looks at me, and he starts to laugh, outwardly laugh. He outwardly laughs at me. He just starts chuckling. And he's like, oh, yeah? Yeah, that's what happened? And I'm like, yeah, that's what he said. And he said, well, where did he go from there? And I said, well, he was put on a destroyer. He went, out to China and that area, Philippines. And then he ended up we do know he was part of this Operation Crossroads, which had been a classified thing, classified operation in Hawaii where they were doing this atom bomb testing. He's like, mm-hmm. He's like, well, I know what I think happened. And he said, what did your grandfather tell you he did? And I said, well, we don't know. I mean, he it sounded like most of the stuff he was talking about was like retreat. Like he was at the the bombings, and he had the task of kind of retrieving stuff. There was a lot of like dead marine life and stuff, and he was kind of he had this background in diving, so he's like, and I'm like, and he had weird stories too, of like him going, like he'd go get drunk guys, he'd be sitting out there, and there's one story I said, and I told him about this thing about walking on the heads of these Chinese guys, getting people, and he's like, yeah. And he said, have you ever asked for information? And I said, I have. I said, in fact, my cousin, he did request it. And he said, what did you get? And I said, well, it was just a very innocuous piece of paper. And all it said was basically his name, his birth. It said that he was a gunnery sergeant. He worked in the boiler room. And that's pretty much it. And he said, well, let me tell you something. And he said, I can tell you this because I'm retired and I still work here for the government. So I'm former NSA. And he said, your grandpa had 2 sets of documents. And I said, what? He said, I know what I'm saying to you sounds crazy, but I'm listening to just the little bits of things you're telling me. And I know this because I've seen it. He said, your grandfather would have had another set of documents. And the document that you received would have been just the basic information that was the public document. His other documents, you're not going to see those, and you will never see those. And I'm like, really, you think so? He's like, listen, I didn't know your grandfather, but I can tell you what I've seen, and I can tell you what you're telling me. And I can tell you that I know what happened, just based off the information that you gave me. And I was like, what does this guy know that I don't know? What am I missing here? And he's like, listen. He said, I've worked here for years. And he said, every person that comes in here, oh, my grandpa, he did this, he did that. He had a Purple Heart, blah, blah, blah. And you look, and it's mostly not true. A lot of this stuff is made up. But he said, I'll tell you this, as a person who worked for the NSA for over 30 years, when my family would ask me what I did, I said, I just worked for the military. He said, old men like to talk and like to tell stories. Your grandpa's not telling stories, and there's reasons for that. This is a point my Uncle Jeff actually brought up. He said he would ask over and over again, and he said Grandpa would never give him a clear answer. It was just, I worked in the military, I was in the war, and don't worry about it. What's so peculiar about this is that Grandpa was a very gregarious, outspoken person who loved to tell stories. In fact, he was a minister. It was his job to tell stories, and yet when it came to this, he never talked about it. Now, could it just be that he suffered so much trauma and some sort of like some type of PTSD situation where just talking about it brought up trauma, and so he avoided talking about it? Could be. But that's not the vibe I got. He didn't seem like he was afraid to talk about it, or it caused him harm to talk about it. It almost seemed as though he wanted to talk about it, but was only able to tell us so much. Well, after having this little bit of conversation with Ken, we continued to talk. We ended up standing there and talking for about an hour. And I said, well, okay, you seem to have some theories about this. Let me tell you some other stuff. I told him about the point pressure things, which he laughed about. And he's like, yep. And then I told him about going to the post office. And I said, why would they come and get him from the post office if he was just a gunnery sergeant, working in the boiler room? And he's like, yeah, they wouldn't. He's like, I know, I can tell you what I think happened. And he said, and I think that we're thinking the same thing. And that point in time, I said, what's your name, sir? And he said, my name's Ken. I said, thank you for your help, Ken. Very interesting. I had to wonder, what was it that I said that made Ken jump to these conclusions? And I don't know, and probably I'll never know. But there is some interesting things that did occur to me. And I'm like, well, all I mentioned was like he got moved around because of the ear thing. I'm like, is this like some type of secret code? Like, ear injury, that means you're moved to special ops or something. I didn't is it that? I mean, I said, I certainly know that Billy Waugh had used that as a specific example of how a person's sometimes reassigned to the back door. But then I also thought, something I've never really thought about is like, what is the process if you get injured in a training? So I started to do a little bit of research. And again, this is not definitive proof, but what I found actually makes sense. Turns out people get injured in trainings all the time, and especially in these really high operative things like Delta or SEALs, it's very commonplace. People break bones, they break arms, they break legs, they break feet, fingers. People get sick, they get bronchitis, they get pneumonia, they get malaria. And yes, people have things blown out, eardrums, eyes get gouged. All this stuff is sort of a normal part of training because the whole point of this training is to push these guys to their limits, to the point where they can't go any further. But in all the accounts I read, if the injury occurs during training, or if they're already through training, it occurs in the line of duty, they're sent to a medic, they're treated until they recover. And once they recover, they're put back on duty. He seemed to think it was funny that a guy in UDT training, old school hardcore UDT training, World War II guys, would get removed for a blown out eardrum. It almost seemed like he did laugh. He thought it was laughable. And he said that, and that's was like, no, that's not what happened. And he didn't even know what I have told you in the previous video, that Grandpa kind of said, well, there's nothing really wrong with his ear, that they just need to relocate him. He didn't have that information. He concluded that on his own. So I thought, well, that's fascinating. What I did find out, furthermore, is that, at least again, what I could find was that it does sometimes happen that someone who goes into some type of specialized training can get removed and replaced and then sort of repositioned elsewhere, in the Navy, for example. But the examples that they gave of this was if a person could not complete the training, right? Meaning that they weren't up to the task. And that was never what Grandpa said. Grandpa never said he didn't make the team because he couldn't make the cut. It was always this ear thing. One of the things that my Uncle Jeff pointed out as well is he said, say what you will, the one thing I can say about Grandpa, or my dad, that was his dad, my grandfather, is he never lied. He always told the truth. And if he said something, it was true. And he said, based off the stories that you're telling and some of the things that he didn't even tell us as kids, it does make me have questions as well, because I don't know why he would have said that about the ear, about them, unless it was true. And again, that seems to match what Ken had to say. Again, it's not definitive, but it's very peculiar. The only other thing I could find was what's called a medical DQ, or a medical disqualification, which sometimes does happen because of trainings, but in this case, they're usually just honorably discharged, meaning that if you can't go back and compete or perform to the tasks that you were doing before you got medically compromised, you're usually just let go. You're not usually demoted. That seemed like kind of a strange stretch, potentially to me, but it also seemed like that to Ken, a former NSA member. But there's also this other story Uncle Jeff told me. And initially, I just took it as a humorous anecdote, because I believe that's why Jeff was telling it to me. And that was a story that after Grandpa got restationed on the destroyer, he had to go meet before whoever his commanding officer, and he found out he was being stationed in the boiler room. I think Jeff was probably trying to tell me this story, one, just because it was a good story, but two, to confirm that Grandpa did actually spend time working in the boiler room. It wasn't just, complete smoke and mirrors. He was down there working in the boiler room. And there's actually several stories of things that happened to him while he was down there, which are interesting in their own right. But when Grandpa finds this out, the story goes, and this is what Jeff said his dad told him. He said, wait, I'm not, I'm a frog man. I'm a frog man. You can't put me in the boiler room. And the commanding officer, his superior, is like, no, you'll go where we tell you to go. And then he got put in the boiler room. So, funny story. But then I thought about this. And I thought about what Jeff said. You can say what you will, but Grandpa never lied. He was very honest about what he did, and he was always honest about his faults. There's a little detail there that could be missed. Why would Grandpa, after being let go from the underwater demolition team to a lesser assignment, still refer to himself as a frogman? Was he just being arrogant? Like, oh, I have all this specialized training. Look, I can do pressure points and stuff. Maybe. I don't know what he was like when he was a young man. Maybe he was arrogant. And maybe he just was, being difficult. But he referred to himself in the story as a frogman. You see, what Ken thinks is that Grandpa finished his training as a Navy SEAL or an underwater demolition team, and that he was reassigned, but under some other operation. Probably special operations, probably not part of officially sanctioned UDT activities. And that guys like this, what I've learned, tended to work as single operatives, meaning they weren't operating as a team. Many times, they would only have one person that was their contact point, which means even the people on his ship wouldn't have known what he was doing, including his commanding officer who put him in the boiler room. Is that true? Who knows? Wait. I've been looking for stuff for years. Everyone in my family's been looking for stuff for years. And there's never been clear answers. There never is going to be clear answers. But after all of this, I decided, where this all started for me was not in a document I found or something I looked up online. It started with this book. And why I liked this book and found it so useful is because it's personal accounts told by the operatives themselves. It's their stories, not unlike the stories that Grandpa used to share. But these guys were lifers. So now they have records. The records that Grandpa either didn't have, wouldn't have had, or if he did have, would have been buried. And they can share their stories. My dad told me something else. But before I tell you that, I want to read this passage from this book, so hold on. This is the beginning of chapter 16, if you want to find out where this passage is. And I'm just going to read it to you. For Billy Waugh, the years spent working for the U.S. Postal Service from 1972 to 1977 were misery incarnate. Then came the mysterious call on July 20th, propelling him back into the world of covert action operation. The location is overseas, the caller said. Fine by me, said Waugh. If Waugh was in, the man on the phone said he'd arranged for a down payment to be wired into his bank account. I'm in, said Waugh. More details would be forthcoming. But in the meantime, Waugh needed to travel north to Virginia and check into a specific hotel at 3 p.m. on July 25th, just a few days away. Waugh agreed to the meeting at the hotel. 48 hours later, a large sum of money appeared in Waugh's bank account. The down payment was twice as much as the post office paid in a year. The overseas job was guaranteed for 6 months, but might continue for years, he was told. All travel and living expenses would be paid for by the client, whose identity was to remain hidden for now. Bringing clothes to last for a year in a very warm climate, the man said, the location's in Africa. Waugh considered the situation. My instincts and intuition told me that this was a CIA operation, he recalls. That the agency was forming some kind of ground team for a covert operation in Africa. I figured this was how the CIA worked. Now the covert action operation had been curtailed. Now, what's interesting about this is several things. One, Waugh's at the post office, his local post office, working, and he'd been there for 5 years. And he receives this call, and it's a call to action, and he doesn't even know the details. He doesn't know who he's working for. He doesn't even know where he's going or why. It's just a can you do it? It's a yes or no question. And his answer is yes. And this matches Grandpa's story, where he would say, I don't know. They would just tell me to go places and do things, and I would do them. I think Grandpa himself didn't know the details. He passed away, so unfortunately we'll never know. But one of the things my cousin Libby pointed out was that her family, her father, was with my grandfather when he passed. He was very cognizant. He was very alert and aware. And if ever there were a chance for Grandpa to share these war stories, the truth behind this, it died with him. So was it because there was nothing there? The Forrest Gump hypothesis? Was it because he was still sworn to secrecy? Or was it because he himself still didn't even know entirely? Well, all that's interesting. But the puzzle around the post office has always been a big one for me. And then I thought, well, did I get the details right about this? Did I misunderstand that? And so I asked my dad, after he told me about these pressure points and some of this weird stuff. And I said, okay, well, let me ask you another question, because the pressure point thing's weird. The ear thing, I'm getting conflicting accounts because I've since learned that my Uncle Gary, who's a medical doctor, at one point in time did inspect my grandfather's ear, presumably for a physical or something, and did find ear damage. And he assumed it was from the war and probably this very incident. So perhaps he did have a real ear injury. Now, again, does that mean he couldn't go back in and train? I don't know. There's so many questions. But I thought that the post office thing is strange. And so I asked my dad, I said, do you remember anything about this? Because all this other stuff, we can find counter explanations, right? It could be he was there at Howard Hughes plane because he was just in the area. It could be that he was there when operation or dispatch, whatever it is, 202 happened because that's just where he was in the ocean. It could be that just this random assignment that put him in Operation Crossroads as part of this task force was just arbitrarily happened. But the post office thing is strange. Not only does it match Billy Waugh's story, I found something completely at random I could have never predicted this, but going through this book again, it's all about finding pieces to a missing puzzle. I want to read this passage. When talking to my dad, he confirmed the post office story. In fact, he gave me more information. He said, well, actually, what I remember is a letter. And I said, a letter? And he said, yeah, they sent a letter to our house. And I said, you saw the letter? He said, yeah, I saw it later. It was a letter Grandpa had. And I said, well, what did the letter say? He said, it was from the government, and they were asking him to see if he would come back in. Like, basically, your service is not over. We need you to come back in. And I said, so it was just a letter? He said, no, my understanding is they did later show up at his job at the post office. But, he did what you said in the video, what Grandma said, which is he, said, oh, I have kids now, and, I can't do it. And I said, well, do you remember, when that was? Like, do you have a time frame? And he said, yeah. He said, Dennis was already a couple of years old. And he said, I was still I'd just been born recently. So I was probably about a year old at the time this happened. I know that because Grandpa said that was one reason. He already had Dennis, who was young in the house, and now he had me, his second child, and I was only about a year old. And it was just too much for him to try to leave home with Grandma at that point in time. And I said, well, what year were you born? And he said, well, I was born in 1951. And I said, okay. And I filed that away in my brain. And then I came across this. The name of this chapter is Special Forces. It's chapter 4 in this book. And if you turn to page 58, there's a page break here. And I'm going to read you this information. This is about going into the Korean War, okay? World War II's done, okay? And here's what we find out. If the U.S. Army went into the Korean War with no formal special operation capabilities, it came out with a plan for an unconventional warfare unit for the use in future wars. Outraged over its stalemate with the CIA regarding who controlled covert operations in Korea, General McClure went directly to Joint Chief of Staff, determined to create for the Army a special forces capability like no other in the world. But to achieve success, said McClure, the organization should start modest and austere. McClure knew the unconventional warfare was frowned upon by most generals in the Defense Department. Remember Douglas MacArthur? He didn't want to jeopardize the potential for success. In its simplest term, the Army's vision for unconditional warfare was to support resistant movements in foreign lands, local guerrilla forces that shared America's pro-Western, anti-communist goals. Any resistance movement that the U.S. Army would engage with would likely be militarized and semi-organized. But to say that the unconventional warfare could ever be defined in simple terms was wishful thinking. Resistance movements were notoriously turbulent, almost always led by charismatic leaders with big personalities, some noble, other corrupt. For the U.S. Army to find success in training equipment, these foreign fighters and special forces operators would have to be flexible, patient, and extremely disciplined. They'd have to be self-reliant, quick-thinking, warriors capable of operating openly and honestly in territories without the support of conventional military force close by. In the winter of 1952, General McClure secured the necessary blessings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The 10th Special Forces Group would be a small, secret unit. Its soldiers would become known as quiet professionals. Finding the right volunteers was a priority. McClure had his adjutant general prepare a roster of ex-OSS officers with commando, ranger, and guerrilla warfare backgrounds. He sent one of his officers to visit with retired General William Donovan at Donovan's law office in New York City. Donovan shared with McClure his personal files containing the names and addresses of more than 3,900 former soldiers who served in the OSS during the war. This would be World War II. The Army sent out queries to hundreds of these individuals, some active duty, service members, others retired, to see if they were interested in volunteering for this clandestine unit. Volunteers had to be at least 21 years of age, airborne qualified or willing to become so, and be able to pass a series of physical and psychological tests. Enlisted men accepted into the Special Forces had to commit to a training in one of more of 5 special areas, including operations, intelligence, engineering, weapon, communications, and medical aid. 1952. Going into the Korean War, McClure and Donovan decide to retrieve old OSS members, people who had gone back to civilian life, send them letters, reach out to them, contact them to see if they would be willing to join up as they start to form this new unit of special forces. The CIA existed in some capacity, but its primary agenda was accumulation of information. It wasn't boots on the ground activity. They're trying to bring forth essentially knuckle draggers, people who've seen action and know how to battle. And that's when they reach out to these guys. And again, the year's 1952. That is the best explanation I've ever found for why and how someone would, 1, know where Grandpa was. Donovan had the files. 2, send him a letter at his home and show up at his job. Now, if this is correct, and it matches not only the stories, it matches the timeline, that means that Grandpa was not only selected, or I shouldn't say selected, he volunteered to be a member of what would become the first SEAL unit ever created. He was targeted and contacted to start the first group of CIA operatives to go into the Korean War. Think about that. I like to close this video with reading 2 more passages because I think they're informative and helpful. This one is about operatives, and it is on page 412 of the book. For ground branch operatives, secrecy and anonymity override every mission. Ground branch operatives work under pseudonyms and regularly change their aliases. They travel into the war theater using a CIA-engineered second passport that has been given the identity separate from the one with which they were born. Exactly what Ken said. And one more. This comes from a man by the name of Kofor Black, who was the man who worked for years helping Billy Waugh. Jacobson is trying to get more information about Waugh. Stuff that Waugh couldn't tell her. She's a journalist, it's her job. And here's what Kofor Black says about Billy Waugh. Most of what Billy Waugh did was never written down. He said almost everything was on a verbal order, from someone like me to someone like him. Things stay hidden this way. That's what I say. 2 sides to every story. I'll let you decide.